Imagine this for a second. What if the entire collected works of one single person, thousands upon thousands of pages of systematic thought, were suddenly dropped into our world today?
Right now.
Right now, could that one person's ideas cause riots, get banned from universities, and just fundamentally reshape the whole conversation between faith and science?
It sounds like fiction, but that is exactly what happened in the High Middle Ages.
And the person was Aristotle. His rediscovery just completely upended Western Europe. Welcome, everyone. We're trying something a little different today, a new in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary.
That's right. Unlike our usual reviews, which are more of a focused analysis, this is all about giving you a really comprehensive overview.
We'll be tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this incredible story.
And we'd genuinely love to know what you think. If you find this format helpful, please let us know. Your feedback really does help us shape what we do next.
Also, just a quick note on how we're doing this. You're listening to a unique two-host conversation, which is powered by Google's Notebook LM.
It allows us to dig in and generate much deeper, more dynamic summaries, especially for material that's as dense as this.
So let's get into it. The book is Richard E. Rubenstein's Aristotle's Children.
And what a title.
Yeah.
It really captures the essence of it. This isn't a dry history of philosophy. It's a story of an intellectual war.
A war.
Absolutely. Rubenstein details this incredibly high-stakes struggle from the 12th to the 14th centuries. You have Christians, Muslims, and Jews all wrestling with this same fundamental problem.
Which is how to reconcile this ancient, purely rational wisdom with their own religious authority, with their revealed truths.
Precisely. And Rubenstein makes it feel so immediate because he focuses on concrete events. We're talking about actual trials, condemnations, university disputes.
And my favorite part, actual student riots.
Yes, riots sparked by arguments over logic and physics.
Okay, so before this Aristotelian revolution hits, what was the intellectual landscape like in Western Europe? What was the mindset that made this so shocking?
Well, before the 12th century, the dominant worldview in Latin Christendom was overwhelmingly shaped by Neoplatonism.
Channeled through giants like Augustine and Boethius.
Exactly. And that culture was fundamentally otherworldly. Its main focus, its primary concern, was the soul's ascent to God.
So all eyes on the next life. On salvation.
Right. The physical world, the world of nature you can see and touch, was often seen as just a distraction or maybe a pale shadow of the true reality, which was the eternal.
And sin was seen as what? A kind of disordered will?
A disordered will, a turning away from the divine. It was an internal spiritual problem.
Okay, that makes the contrast so stark. Because if their eyes are fixed on the eternal, the spiritual, then Aristotle lands on their desks.
And he is the philosopher of the here and now. He is intensely focused on empirical observation, on understanding the world through the senses, natural law, politics, human happiness achieved in this life, biology, physics.
His entire system basically says that understanding reality starts with the physical world.
The very world that Neoplatonism had taught them to devalue. It was a complete inversion of priorities.
And the church itself wasn't really in a place to handle this, was it? They'd been suppressing this kind of inquiry for a while.
They had, and that just made the shock worse. The book has a chapter called The Murder of Lady Philosophy. It's a powerful metaphor for how speculative, rational thinking was pushed to the margins as the church consolidated its power.
The priority became authority, revelation, doctrine.
Doctrinal conformity, exactly. So when Aristotle arrived, Europe was just intellectually ill-equipped. Its training was spiritual, not systematic or empirical.
So how did this massive body of work, which was almost entirely lost to the West, suddenly reappear? It's a story of intellectual debt, really.
It absolutely is. And the rediscovery happened in these amazing intellectual borderlands. The book really focuses on cities like Toledo in Spain.
Which had recently been reconquered by Christian forces.
Right, but it still had these incredible libraries and, more importantly, these thriving communities of Jewish and Muslim scholars who had been studying Aristotle for centuries. It was an uneasy collaboration, but a vital one.
And we're not talking about a simple, clean translation from Greek to Latin.
No, that's a key point. The layers of interpretation were part of the shock. Aristotle's Greek texts often came into Latin through Arabic and Hebrew intermediaries.
So they weren't just getting Aristotle.
They were getting Aristotle plus centuries of brilliant commentary from thinkers who had already been using his system. People like the Muslim philosopher Averroes or Jewish scholars deeply influenced by Maimonides.
And this wasn't just a little stream of new information, it was a flood.
An absolute flood. Rubenstein emphasizes that the sheer volume of this thought covering everything from planetary motion to the ethics of government was by some accounts greater than the entire existing body of Latin scholarly work at the time.
Wow.
But it wasn't just the volume, it was the substance. For instance, Aristotle's idea of God was an unmoved mover.
Kind of cold, impersonal first cause.
Exactly. Not a personal, loving creator God who intervenes in history. That's a direct challenge to Scripture.
And the commentaries were even more dangerous.
Some of them, yes. The commentaries from Averroes, what became known as Averroism, suggested things like the unity of the intellect.
Which sounds technical, but what did it imply?
It seemed to imply that the individual human soul was not immortal. That shattered a core Christian belief.
So you have this shockwave of systematic philosophy paired with some really terrifying commentary. And this is where figures like Peter Abelard come in. How did he turn these abstract ideas into, well, conflict?
Abelard is one of the key children of Aristotle in the book. He's the one who really weaponized the method. His famous approach in his work, Sic et non yes and no,
He would set authorities against each other.
deliberately. He'd pose a question and then use Aristotelian logic to show how two respected church fathers, or even passages of Scripture, seem to contradict each other.
He wasn't necessarily trying to destroy the faith, but he was using reason to poke holes in doctrines that were supposed to be unquestionable.
It was a revolutionary act.
This deep dive into intellectual history is brought to you with the help of Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel.
There you can find AI book analyses, summaries, and critiques, all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought.
It's also a really valuable resource for aspiring authors. So these weren't just theoretical debates. Why couldn't the church just burn the books and be done with it? Why did they have to engage?
Because the system was just too compelling. It was too comprehensive, too logical. Once that method of rational inquiry is out of the bag, you can't put it back in.
Banning the book isn't an argument.
Right. You'd have no counter-argument. So this revolution had to become institutionalized. The new universities, especially the University of Paris, became the battlegrounds.
Along with the new religious orders, the Dominicans and Franciscans.
Yes. And it was actually the friars who saw the power in this new toolkit. They embraced Aristotle to train a new, more sophisticated generation of preachers and theologians. But that, of course, created enormous tension.
Because the authorities were terrified.
They could see where it was heading. They worried philosophy would just completely undermine faith by giving reason the final say.
And this led to the bans.
It led to a series of dramatic condemnations. The most famous was in 1277, when the Bishop of Paris, Tempier, condemned over 200 propositions drawn from Aristotle and his commentators.
The idea that the world was eternal must have been the biggest crisis point.
It was the perfect flashpoint. Think about it. If Aristotle is right and the world has always existed, then you don't need God to start it, only to sustain it.
Which challenges the biblical doctrine of creation from nothing.
It challenges ex nihilo, which is central to the idea of God's total power and freedom. And these weren't just abstract arguments. They led to those street fights between student factions we mentioned earlier.
This massive clash needed a peacemaker. And the book presents Thomas Aquinas with this brilliant metaphor, the marriage of faith and reason.
It's a perfect metaphor.
Okay.
Aquinas is basically cast as the marriage counselor, trying to find a way to harmonize Aristotle's philosophical outlook with Christian doctrine.
But not by making philosophy subordinate to theology.
That was his revolutionary move. He argued they could both operate legitimately as long as they respected their boundaries. He drew these clear lines.
So reason could prove certain things.
Yes. Using Aristotelian methods, reason could demonstrate things accessible to the human intellect. Things like God's existence, through arguments from motion, or the existence of a natural law.
So reason builds the foundation.
And faith takes over where reason hits its limit.
So things like the Trinity, the Incarnation.
Those remain mysteries, strictly matters of divine revelation. By doing this, he could use Aristotle to strengthen Christian thought. For instance, his idea that the soul is the form of the body gave a new dignity to physical reality, while still protecting core doctrines from dangerous claims, like the world being eternal.
It sounds like an incredible synthesis, but as the book shows, the marriage didn't last. The narrative moves to the divorce of faith and reason with William of Ockham.
Ockham was a major critic of Aquinas' project. For him, it all came down to divine omnipotence. God's will is radically, absolutely free.
So trying to box God in with human reason was a mistake.
A huge mistake in Ockham's view. He argued that you can't prove much about God's nature or purposes through reason alone. Trying to confine God with philosophical categories, as Aquinas had, was limiting his power.
And this move to separate the two fields more sharply, often associated with Occam's razor, what was the ultimate consequence of that? Maybe an unintended one.
It was huge, and almost certainly unintended. By narrowing theology's domain to revelation, Ockham unintentionally opened up this massive conceptual space for philosophy.
If reason can't tell us much about God, it's free to focus elsewhere.
Exactly. It's free to investigate the observable, empirical world physics, motion, ethics, without constant theological interference. That philosophical move was a vital seed for what would, centuries later, become modern empirical science and secular thought.
Which brings us to the book's conclusion. Rubenstein really pushes back against this caricature of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages.
He does. He argues that this intellectual vibrancy, this intense conflict and labor, is precisely why that caricature is so wrong. This is how knowledge actually progresses.
And that misconception comes from where?
Largely from later Enlightenment thinkers who were pushing their own agenda and wanted to paint the preceding era as one of pure superstition.
And this brings it all back to today. The book makes a powerful case that this medieval struggle isn't just a historical footnote. It's a process that's still going on.
It is. Understanding how Aristotle's children, across all three traditions, tried to integrate new scientific understanding with their spiritual commitments is so relevant.
It's a roadmap for how modern societies can navigate our own conflicts between faith and science.
Without falling into either fanaticism on one side or a kind of empty nihilism on the other. They show that you can have profound spiritual commitments and still engage fully with a rational world.
It's a fascinating lesson.
It is. And maybe a final thought for you to consider is this. The substance of the challenge changes, but the core tension remains.
You mean?
Well, just think about which parts of modern scientific thought, whether it's AI ethics or genetic engineering or quantum mechanics, are fundamentally challenging our current moral or political frameworks.
Just like Aristotle's physics challenged medieval theology.
Exactly. It's the same continuous struggle to reconcile what we know with what we believe.
A really profound thought to end on. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally. See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.